Hello, it's Duncan, and we're back again, refamiliarizing. That's easy for you to say. We're back again, refamiliarizing ourselves with the Gilded Rose codebase after our enforced holiday over Christmas, shall we call it? Looking around the code, it occurs to us that we don't actually have a test that runs up the server. The closest we've got is our list stock test here, which creates some routes based around some stock. But there is all this code here that is in our main function that isn't tested, and that leaves us a bit nervous. It means that every time we check in and push to production, we really want to check it manually because we've not got a great deal of confidence. So what we'd like to do is get more of this under test. And we'll put this in our list stock test for now. So how would we do that? Well, I think the answer is that we would take as much of this as possible and make another function that we could call. And what we're doing here is we're creating some routes. So if we pull that out into here, and then the input to our server is effectively our stock file. So if we were to take all of this stuff and make a method out of it, we could call that routes for, and then this would be our stock file. Then we would have a thing that we call in our test. So let's have a look at that. Let's make this public so we can call it from our test. That shouldn't have changed anything. We'll just run a test to check that we can. And now let's look at how that would change our list stock tests. So our list stock tests are currently approvals tests, which means that when they run, they check that the output is this HTML, basically. So we'd like not to break that. So, and at the moment they take stock itself. But what we'd like to do is we'd like to input a file, basically. So the test would, instead of creating stock and feeding it into our routes, it would create a file that our application would read in order to start up. So let's think about how we do that. And if we're creating files in tests, it's helpful to have a clean file every time. So we'll ask JUnit to create a test directory that we can put a file in every time. So there's some annotation. I think it's testdir, tempdir, that we can annotate a value with in order to have JUnit inject it for us. So this is a dir that's a file. Now, IntelliJ points out that we haven't initialized this, and we have this late init, which is kind of hateful, but will do the trick. So if we should at least be able to run this. Hasn't broken anything. And so armed with the tempdir, we should be able to say, well, I've got this val, maybe a private val, that is my stock file. And that is my directory, and it's a stock.tsv in that directory. Let's try running that. And when we do, we find that this is trying to be called when the constructor for our class is called, but JUnit only comes along and fills this thing in later after the constructor has been called, which is a bit irritating. What we'd like is tempdir to work on constructor parameters to our class, that they would be initialized before we get in here, but it doesn't. So we can solve that problem by making this a lazy property, which means it will only be resolved the first time we call it, which won't be at all if we just run now. So that will at least give us something. Okay, that's all good. And now, instead of creating some stock, we're going to create some stock and save it. And we save not a list of stock, but a stock list, the class. So in here, we're going to create a stock list, and it's got a last modified. So we'll set that for the moment to be instant now. Reformat that a bit. It shows that we need another brace there. Now, what we'd like to do is save that. So we can say stock.save to our stock file. And having done that, instead of creating the roots directly, we are going to go to our main. Let's pick that up, put it over there so we can see it, and call this roots for the stock file. And that will return this HTTP handler that is in fact the thing that we are calling here. So let's just have a go at that. So instead of calling roots stock, we call roots for stock file. And import that. Now, when we were calling this other roots, let's go and have a look at that. That's this one. We were passing in this thing we called a calendar, which is a way of getting the time. We probably need to push that out into here so we can control it, because we know that it's been set to some sort of fixed thing for our tests so that the approval tests don't have to change every time because the date changes. So what we're going to do is we're going to push that parameter up into here. Just reformat that. And that will allow us to pass the calendar into here. And then that means that this compiles. So those are now our roots, and let's see whether this passes. It does. So now at least for a fixed file, we have this more of our main code under test. Let's have a little tidy up before we go on. We should be able to inline that because it's not doing anything for us. We don't actually need stock at all because we're just calling this for a side effect of saving it. So here we're creating a stock list, we're saving it to a stock file, we're creating some roots, and we're saying, what do we get out? That's really good. Let's tidy up just a little bit more before we check in. You can see that we don't need this roots anymore, so it's inline that. And looking through this, we are creating a new file. If we don't have one when we start up, well, we're dealing with running software now, so we know that we will always have a file, so we should be able to take that out quite happily. And we also have this residual stock save to stock file here that was left over from our previous upgrading the stock file to add the last modified date to it. So again, that can go. So try and stay as absolutely simple as we can. Check that all passes, and it does. So let's commit that. And this is bring more of main under test. Splendid. Now we have one big outstanding problem really, and that's that we currently load the stock file when we start up the server. So here we call roots for file, that loads the items, and from ever on then that will be the list of items that's returned when we make a request. What we'd like is to be able to see updates to the file live, so there's somebody edited the file or another thread in our application wrote the file, that a new request would see that new version of the file. Let's write what we'd like in a test. We'll duplicate that. And then we'll say list stock sees file updates. So what that mean? That would mean that if we started off this way and we made a request, and then say we wrote a file with nothing in it, so we'll do that, and then we'll say stock list instant now with an empty list. Save to file. Then we would want to see an empty an HTML file that had no items in it. So let's duplicate that line, pull it down here, and we don't want to approve this one, we just want to make that first request. And in fact, what we could say is that we expect this request to succeed and then this request to succeed this way. So we could say roots, we could say assert equals and then routes dot status will want to be OK. So if we run that, we'll see that it fails. And it fails because it has written a file and we don't have an approved file. But when we look in what the file that it has written, the contents of this HTML page, we'll see that it does have banana and kumquat, it does have items in it. And we don't want that to happen. So what we could do is we could say, well, we want an empty table here, so let's take this out of here. That reflects what we want to see. And let's approve that as the change that we want to see. If we run this, the test will still fail. But now it will fail because there's a difference between our output and our approved, and the difference is the items in the table. We want there to be no items in the table because we've written an empty stock list. Okay, how do we then arrange to read the stock list every time we make a request? At the moment, you can see we're reading it when we start here. Let's have a look in routes. You see we've got a static list of items here, and it's an immutable list. So it can't change, so we'll never see any differences. We had two options here. We could pass in a mutable list of items, so that every time we made a request, we read from the file, we updated this mutable list of items to reflect what was in the file, and then this code here would see the changed version and it would work. Or we can pass in a different list every time, an immutable list which changes. And that's where we're going to go. And that's our stock list, actually. So if we say that this would be stock list rather than list of item, that means that we'd see the other information we passed from the file, the last modified date. But we don't want to pass in a static stock list here. What we want to pass in is something that will give us a stock list, and that's a function. So it's a function type that takes nothing and returns a stock list. And that's very much like our calendar, which was a function that took nothing and returned a local date. And as with the calendar here, where every request, we ask the calendar when now is, every request we'll ask the calendar what the stock list is. And we find out by asking this function that we called stock. And then this stock list is the thing we can pass into our view model in order to render. If we try and run that, it won't compile because we don't have a function here, we have just a stock list. But we can change this into a function just by putting it in braces to make it a lambda. That will compile, but it still doesn't pass our tests because this lambda is still just returning a thing that was resolved at the point where we started up. But if we inline this into here, then this lambda will be called every time the routes needs the stock list, and it will update. If we run that, doesn't quite pass. Doesn't pass with an irritating white space, but that white space isn't going to make a difference to anybody, so let's just approve that as what we actually get. And now if we run, our test pass. Do a little bit of tidying up before we go on. This would be better, I think, if these were on separate lines. It would be better if these were given names so we could see what they were doing. Over here in our test, I'll just run it just in case. This is a bit noisy, it's hard to see the wood for the trees. This local date now is actually, I think, the October the 29th we have lying around there, and if it's that, then we can inline all those, and that will still pass. This stock list now is doing nothing for me really. The details of it aren't important because they're hidden around in actually the improved file. So let's take that thing and make and we'll call it, I don't know what, standard stock list. And I pulled this out as static and outside the class because to sort of highlight the fact that it is common. And I tend to put that down the bottom. And now, in fact, this standard stock list is here. October the 29th is in stock tests. Let's create ourselves a place to hold these things. And we'll call it test data. Refactor. Add that. And our standard stock list can go in there as well. We might find that there are other places that we've used that. Make that less private to start with. Move it into our test data. And run that. That's nice. Now, in fact, when we look here, you can see that our roots could be pulled out as part of our test fixture. So if we pull that out into there, and there. And so now we can see the structure of our tests a bit better. But it fails. Why does it fail? Well, again, we are trying to resolve this stock file. This stock file we're trying to resolve at the point where we create this instance of this class, but JUnit hasn't come in and fixed up this temp.j yet. So again, we can make this lazy. It's a bit of a slippery slope, but one more won't do any harm. Okay, I think that's quite a nice place to be. Have a little review of what we've got lying around. We have list stock tests. That's what we're working on at the moment. I think this could probably be better named. It is listing stock, but it's also showing what's happening when we start up. As we gain more things in here, we'll split it out into better named things. Persistence test we were working on last time. It's got a nice green tick. And I think that's fine. Stock tests, though, I think this was just very early on when we were looking at how we might represent stock. Actually, all we seem to be doing is testing list of item, which is doing nothing for me. So let's delete that. No point in having code lying around that isn't doing anything for us. Run all of our tests. And that's good. And then finally, we now have tests that run up the server, which is nice, but we'd like to just check that they are actually testing the thing we think they're testing. So let's just run our main. And check the code works as we expect. So we'll check that we have a running server, and we do. And then this is set to 102 days. Let's actually just go and edit the stock file. Make that 100 days, save it, reload, and you'll see that we see the change. So we have managed to make the change we wanted. Revert that, save, back here, reload, and we have a working server. So let's commit that, and I think we're done for the day. See what we have. We have our approved file for the list stock tests. We've added test data. We've deleted stock tests. Our main and roots have changed because we have changed this interface and we've added our roots for. I think that's all good. So this is load stock file for every request. As we write that, that seems a bit wasteful that we read the file on every request, but thinking it through, it's only what databases would be doing if we had one anyway. So I think this keeps our code nice and simple. And if it becomes a problem, it's a problem we can solve later if we get our interfaces right. Okay, let's commit that. And I think we're done for the day. Thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed this, I think you might enjoy Nat Price in my book. And tune in, like, subscribe, all those things for the next episode where we will look at changing the stock's quality over time. Thank you.